Jill's Magical Boobs, Part 1. Are you going to the meeting? I turned at the interruption, startled from the task I was absorbed in. It was, as I expected, my office mate, Cheri. She stood in the doorway, leaning slightly to peer around my bookcase. Yeah, I answered quickly. I grabbed my planner and scooted my chair back from my computer, hastening to follow Cheri as she hurried down the hall. I guess you could argue that technically, Cheri was my boss. But the organization chart, with the teamed companies and matrixed staff, it wasn't really clear. And I was the leading engineer in the branch, so she relied heavily on me. Cheri was an organizer, perfectly suited to the role of supervising the subcontractors, and she was comfortable in management. At 30, she had the job early, but she'd more than demonstrated her competence. And being single didn't hurt her cause. She was able to put in the overtime needed for her job. I, on the other hand, was almost 40, and while I had a couple of advanced degrees, I was perfectly happy to be doing engineering rather than managing. In fact, I'd recently turned down a promotion so I could avoid the management hassles. A little now and again was required, but I had more time to spend at home. Having recently divorced, I was trying to re-establish a social life and was dating a young lady. I caught up to Cheri just as she strode into the conference room. If she hadn't had such a head start, I'd have caught up sooner. With my 6-foot height and long legs, I naturally walked quite a bit faster than her. We took our usual seats, and the meeting got off to its usual boring start. I hated these meetings. As I sat, bored, I glanced at Cheri, seated at the head of the table. I found myself doing that a lot. While she could have stood to lose 10 or 15 pounds, she was still an attractive woman. 5'7", give or take. I was certain she dyed her hair, the long auburn tresses seemed to have light brown roots sometimes, and she had to have a perm or spend a lot of time every morning, getting that lovely wave to her hair. The curls danced above her bosom, and right up to her temples, a lovely cascade that danced with her every motion. And her breasts, every time I saw her curves in a clingy sweater or blouse, I couldn't keep my eyes off. Not huge but also not tiny, Cheri's boobs were very enticing. And it wasn't like she wore anything racy or sexy to show off cleavage. On the contrary, she was usually a very conservative dresser. It was just that, in the right outfit, her breasts were like magnets to my eyes. Like today. She was wearing a tan skirt, which nicely accentuated the form of her rear. I'd watched that, too, as she walked ahead of me to this meeting. A white sweater clung to her like spray paint, and the faint seam lines of her bra were on display. As were her nipples, two small little nubs disturbing the gentle curve of the fabric as it swept across her bustline. And rarely, Cheri wore a modest but slightly revealing blouse, displaying a hint of cleavage and the freckles on her bosom. As I admired the lovely pair, I doubted that anyone else noticed them. But I'd learned to pay attention to her curves. Well, Jill, what do you think? Cheri's voice interrupted my study of her curvaceous anatomy. I was caught. I hadn't been paying attention to the discussion or the charts, and now she wanted a technical evaluation from me. But I didn't panic. I'd been in this situation before. I frowned and tried to look thoughtful for a few seconds as I tapped my fingers together. I mumbled. There's something that just doesn't seem right. I studied the chart on the screen for a few more seconds. Fortunately, the subcontractor was sloppy enough that I could always find something to focus on. I'm not sure that the firewall is going to give us a growth path. I turned to Cheri and saw that she was giving me a curious look. I turned back to the chart. I'd like to take a hard look at the performance before we okay it. Cheri nodded and made a note to herself. All around us, the subcontractors were frantically scribbling in their planners. Then I thought I saw Cheri wink at me. You know, Jill, you really ought to pay more attention, Cheri chided from her desk. I glanced up, and saw that curious smile again. Huh? You're my backup. You have to be ready to fill my shoes. She turned and picked up the phone. My desk was covered with the hardware spec books as I dug into the new task added to my already full plate. But I'd gotten myself into it by thinking about Cheri's body rather than the meeting. And why not? She wasn't a beauty queen, but she was attractive. I found her body admirable. I stole a glance across the empty space between our desks and saw her curves neatly displayed once again. She was busy talking on the phone, which gave me a chance to gaze for a few seconds. She suddenly stopped talking and spun her head. I tried to move my head toward the window, to make it look like I hadn't been staring at her. But I knew I'd been caught. She was staring right at me, and I had to look back into her eyes. She stared at me long and hard, her face a mixture of puzzlement and amusement. Finally, she leaned back in her chair, her back arched slightly. "You seem to like these things," she said as her hands moved up to just under her breasts. I stammered and stumbled over my tongue, trying to say something that would get me out of trouble. I started, then paused again. The look on her face was pure amusement at my predicament. That is. Well, you were kind of nice to look at. This could be the end. Sexual harassment. The end of a career. Cheri's smile broadened. "Oh?" she asked, and the surprise in her voice was clearly false. She glanced down, and stared at herself for a second or two. "Now that you mention it," she muttered. Then she looked at me. "But you know, it's probably not the same from my perspective." I started to breathe a sigh of relief. She was taking this better than I'd expected, and I was convinced I was going to get off the hook. Then she waved her hands slightly. My eyes nearly bulged out of their sockets. As soon as her hands stopped moving, her boobs shrank. It was like watching two balloons deflating as the air went out of them. Even the seam lines of her bra vanished, and the sweater seemed to remold itself to fit a flat chest. I glanced up, and saw her grinning like the Cheshire Cat. I'm not sure what it was that caused me to look down. Maybe it was the slight tug on my chest and shoulders. It might have been the sudden feeling of my ribs being held tight. But I did look down. In cartoons, the characters' eyes swell up to enormous size and the eyeballs pop out of their heads when they are startled. I sure felt like that happened to me. On my chest were Cheri's boobs. The full, round, curvy outlines of breasts were unmistakable, and I could see the seams of a bra through my shirt. Except they seemed a bit larger, as if her boobs had been scaled to my proportions. Slowly, I looked up at Cheri and saw her smiling at me. "This perspective is better," she said sweetly as if discussing the weather rather than suddenly swapped body parts. "You know, I see your point. They really are kind of nice to look at." But I sputtered, confused. What? My jaw worked feverishly, but words just wouldn't come out. What I saw was impossible, and yet, my chest had two very female boobs. "How?" Cheri smiled mischievously. "Go on. Touch them. You know you want to." I stared at her, my mouth hanging open incredulously. How slowly, I bent my head forward as my hands lifted to the orbs. As if touching a hot iron, my fingers delicately probed. And even as I felt the soft flesh of breasts against my fingers, I felt my own fingers touching my chest. I glanced up at Cheri even as my hands cupped the new growths, my eyes full of fear and wonder. "Magic," she answered my unspoken question. "I use magic." "But," I sputtered, still confused, "that's impossible. There's no such thing as magic?" Cheri smiled sweetly. "So how come you have breasts now?" I just stared, open-mouthed. "Well, if you were getting distracted gawking at them, maybe that'll help you concentrate during the next meeting." I slowly comprehended what she'd said, even as I realized that my fingers were playing with my nipple. And as I felt a growing tingling sensation in my chest, I realized that I had an erection. I trembled as I breathed, feeling the strange but wonderfully new sensations on my chest. Cheri smiled coyly, then glanced down at my lap. I followed her gaze and then blushed. It was obvious that I was aroused. "Or maybe not," she laughed. I guess it might take you a while to get used to how sensitive they are. She stood and gathered up her planner. Now let's get to the review. I continued to stare at her in disbelief. But I stared at her flat chest, then down at my swollen one. But I can't go like this. For the briefest of seconds, she seemed concerned. Then her grin returned. Why not? I felt a surge of panic. Was she going to make me go to this meeting, with boobs? She laughed at my discomfort. Oh, relax, she chided. No one will notice. Well, no one besides you and me. It's part of the spell. She turned back toward the door. Now come on. Reluctantly, I rose, my hand still cupping the impossible flesh on my chest. She was serious about going to the review, and I had no choice but to go as well. I bent over to pick up my planner and felt the boobs swinging slightly, confined as they were by the bra I was somehow wearing. The sensations were strange and alien as the boobs bounced and swayed with my every movement. Each step caused a jiggle of tit flesh, reminding me of the humiliating orbs on my chest. And yeah, no one seemed to notice. It was as if everything were perfectly normal. I heard a door slam, and I turned, startled, half expecting that someone finally would have noticed. But no, the only thing out of place was the strong tug as my large heavy breast swung, adding their inertia to my motion and causing me to stagger momentarily. I caught myself against the drinking fountain, and as a co-worker came around the corner, I bent over the fountain, both to conceal my chest and to cover for my clumsiness. Again, I felt the tug and sway of the boobs, dangling from my chest, almost flowing into the cups of the bra. I walked slowly into the conference room, ready to cut and run if anyone should say anything. Cheri was already seated at the table, and she winked as I came in. I gulped and glanced around. To my profound relief, everyone was acting normally. I glanced back at Cheri, and she gave me a tiny nod as if to say I told you so. The meeting was one of the longest I've ever endured. Every time I moved, I felt the breasts jiggling to remind me of the alteration. And with each reminder, I worried that someone was finally going to notice. I tried to remain absolutely still. And Cheri had been right. I concentrated on the subject of the meeting. I plopped my planner into my briefcase, then slammed it shut. It was quitting time, and even though I was ready to go, I stayed. Cheri was in a senior management meeting, and I had to wait for her. I still had her boobs on my chest, and I was getting very frustrated. Jenny was expecting me to meet her at Marco's for dinner, and unless that meeting ended soon, I had the awful choice of having to cancel on Jenny or going home with Cheri's breasts still attached to my chest. I knew that I couldn't stand up Jenny. We seemed to be clicking. So that left me the option I really didn't want to keep the boobs. Just as I was about to leave, Cheri came merrily into our office. She glanced at my briefcase. Oh, is it quitting time? I glared at her. Yes, it is, and you know I've got a date. Cheri smiled at me. Oh, that's right. Well, have fun. I started to cross my arms angrily and found them stopped as they ran into the boobs. Cheri tried to suppress a giggle, which made me angrier. I moved my arms until they were sort of crossed, under the breasts. That just pushed them up and out, accentuating the strange chest adornments. Cheri couldn't stop the laugh that caused. Well? I demanded. I need you to put them back. Cheri shook her head. Nope. No? I sputtered. But you have to. Why? No one will notice. She turned and left the office, leaving me sputtering in her wake. Now I really didn't have a choice. What's wrong? Jenny asked for what seemed like the 1000th time. She'd noticed that I was uncomfortable for some reason. We were sitting in a corner booth in the restaurant, and despite the soft light and wine, I was feeling tense. Normally, I wouldn't have. Jill was fun and warm and thoroughly enjoyable to be with. And she was cute. 28 years old, 5'5" and 130 pounds, she had a dynamite figure. She wore her hair shorter than I liked, but it was very nicely styled, soft and feminine. And her smile, it would melt an iceberg. Only now, she wasn't smiling. I shook my head. Just something that came up at work. I could hardly tell Jenny, since, as Cheri had predicted, she hadn't noticed anything. Jenny took a sip of her wine. "Well, I know how to take your mind off work," she said coyly. I gulped. So far, everything had gone okay. But this. I tried to smile, but the rest of the dinner was filled with unspeakable dread. We got back to my condo, and Jenny started to snuggle with me on the couch. She could tell I was feeling tense, so she scooted behind me and started to rub my back. She really had a way of giving a massage. I felt the anxiety melting, even as she leaned a bit forward and nibbled on my ear. Her left hand slid off my shoulder and around my chest. Involuntarily, I tensed. What if she felt them? How could she miss it? There was no way I was going to get out of this one. And yet, she didn't notice. Her hand stroked my chest, and to her, I'm sure she thought it was normal. But I didn't. I felt her hand across those sensitive nipples. I glanced down, and saw the nipples, hard and erect little nubs, pushing through the bra and my shirt. While the feel of her hands had always been nice, now, with these nipples, it was powerfully stimulating. Slowly, my fear melted, replaced with the heat of passion. It didn't take long at all to get me fully aroused. My hand slid behind my back to Jenny, and I began to tend to her needs. Jenny pushed me forward until I slumped off the couch onto the floor. With a deft twist, she spun herself around, sliding down onto my lap, her hand still stroking my chest. Her hungry lips met mine. My hands roamed to her breast and crotch. She whimpered with anticipation of even more stimulation. I gasped in surprise as my hand met her wet womanhood. I hadn't even noticed when she'd taken off her panties. Now, she was wet and ready as I continued to touch her. She pushed me roughly to my back, then her hands desperately tore at my belt and zipper. I thrust my butt up off the floor so she could pull my pants down from my waist, and as soon as my rod was exposed, she pushed me back to the floor and began to rub herself on it. Faster and faster she went until her body trembled, and then she impaled herself on my shaft. As she convulsed around me in the throes of an orgasm, I pumped eagerly into her. The swaying and bobbing weights on my chest were forgotten as I strove to satisfy our lust. After I stopped thrusting, she collapsed on top of me, both of us sweating and gasping to catch our breath. And then, without warning, she sat up, a look of puzzlement on her face. She glanced down, and then the look changed to shock and disbelief. What the? She was staring at the tits on my chest. I glanced down, and saw them, then looked back up at Jenny. She saw them. I was confused. Cheri had told me that no one else would notice. I began slowly, fumbling for words. Well, you see. Jenny reached out tentatively to touch one, and as her fingers made contact with the breast, she flinched. What's going on here? She asked again, her voice still echoing her confusion. Cheri gave them to me. It sounded stupid. You know Cheri? My boss? She was staring at the impossible tits. She's kind of a witch or something. Jenny looked up at me, and I couldn't tell if she was angry or confused or dumbfounded. What the hell are you talking about? She finally said. A witch? Like in magic? I swallowed. This sounded really lame. Yeah. She thought I was staring at her, so she gave me these. I glanced down at the offending objects. She said that if I wasn't staring at her, I'd probably be less distracted. But Jenny was trying to accept the impossible. But why didn't I see them before? Her hand reached up to touch a boob again. This time, she didn't recoil. I winced. I don't know. Cheri said that no one else would notice. And you didn't. Not until after. I had a sudden thought. Maybe the sex cancelled out part of her spell? Take off your shirt. Jenny was insistent for some reason, so I started to comply. As soon as my shirt was unbuttoned, she saw the bra. I expected some type of reaction, and I got one, only it wasn't quite what I anticipated. When she saw the lacy bra on my heretofore manly chest, she started to giggle. I felt like I was being mocked, and I started to scowl. Only, to her, it looked like a pout. "Oh, come on. Be a sport." She helped me take the shirt off. Then she reached behind me and unhooked the bra. A weight was lifted from my shoulders, where the straps had been supporting the breasts. But my chest muscles took up the load, and I felt a strong tug forward as they sagged and bounced free of the confining bra. Jenny was still sitting sort of in my lap, and I had my hands splayed out behind me, supporting my body at an angle. I saw the boobs hanging down off my chest. The amount of sag surprised me. I had not realized just how much support a woman got from the bra. Jenny started to touch one nipple, and the sensitive nerves made me tremble and gasp for a quick breath. She glanced up, and smiled. "Feels good, doesn't it?" Then she leaned forward, and her mouth met the nipple. If her touch had been pleasant, her tongue was electric. The pleasurable feeling exploded outward from my chest. I felt a stirring in my groin. Without removing her mouth, Jenny glanced up, smiling. As soon as my shaft was back at attention, Jenny leaned back, and slowly laid back on the rug. Her legs spread wide open. I needed no further invitation. I leaned forward over her and slowly lowered my body toward hers. The unfamiliar sensation of boobs dangling from my chest distracted me, and I peeked to see them hanging, looking larger than ever as they swayed and bobbed free of any support. Jenny's hands lifted to cup them, and the pleasure resumed. I found her waiting for crevasse with my rod and slowly began to stroke within her. It was a thoroughly disorienting experience to have such powerful stimulation around my dick, while at the same time, have good-sized breasts dangling from my chest and being ministered to by my girlfriend. The combination of stimuli had me at another orgasm quickly, and as I collapsed onto Jenny, I felt the boobs on my chest pressing into hers. Half asleep, I rolled, trying to escape the sensation of having boobs. My eyes snapped open as I rolled onto my chest, and the boobs were squashed between my torso and the bed. I felt like a thick pillow was sandwiched beneath my chest, and at the same time, a ton of weight was squishing the boobs. I rolled again and felt the boobs sway and jiggle. I sighed heavily as I settled onto my side, one boob smashed against my arm, and the other flowing onto the bottom breast. Even a simple thing like sleeping was proving to be difficult with these melons on my chest.